You are listening to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our sponsor, MSP-Ignite. MSP-Ignite offers a peer group experience that is unique to managed service providers in the technology industry. If you are serious about implementing a model for success through sharing and collaboration of best practices, this is the best way to do it. Head on over to msp-ignite.com to get more information. All right, on to the show. Welcome to this episode of MSP 1337. I'm joined again this week by Matthew Schroeder. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me again. I really appreciate it.
Hey, so this episode just kind of sprang up as I was thinking about our conversation. We've been talking about reasons to go back to school for master's degrees, and we were specifically talking about cybersecurity management. And as we continued the conversation, we kind of went down a rabbit hole on a tangent with regards to communication. And obviously, communication is a big part of the cybersecurity world because if you're not a good communicator, then when you're dealing with incident response plans and some of this other stuff, communication can fall apart really fast. And I want to take this moment as we were just like, don't want to forget it. We started talking about what is acceptable and what are the response times and when we're using personal devices versus work devices. So you brought up one, I'll let you start. Talk to me about some of the things that you're dealing with, like just even at school and communicating with your professors of what's frustrating and just having an email dialogue.
So in general, most of my classes, I am in my younger 20s, and most of my classes, I am with some older classmates. And sometimes when I have a lot of projects, like group projects and stuff like that, there isn't, the dialogue isn't always as clear and crisp, it feels like, with communications, whether it be email most often, or even like the Google chats that we were talking about earlier. It's just really weird to see the difference between my generation and maybe a different generation and how they might communicate using this type of technology, and kind of just understanding. And that helps me understand how in the future, when I'm in the industry and in a career path, how I will communicate with my own coworkers and stuff like that, because there's a good chance that they're going to be older than me, and it's good to understand kind of how they, speak and relate to other people.
Do you think it's, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but you ever get a text message from someone who's older and it's like they just wrote you a book and it's like part one of part two, and it's like, if you're sending text messages that come in parts, there's a good chance that it probably should have been sent as an email.
Yes, definitely. And I get that all the time when, you get 2 or 3 long texts. Usually when I see the bubble extend from 1 to 2, that's when I'm like, all right, maybe
come back to this later.
Or call me on the phone or something like that. And I think you were bringing up a really good point about calling people and stuff like that, because I feel like that is used a lot less nowadays, just because of how big popular text messaging has gotten to. But I still believe, though, that some phone calls you can, you brought up context. I think that's a huge thing nowadays that people need to still implement into their social skills and stuff like that, is being able to understand context and critically think about situations and stuff.
Well, so along those same lines, before we kind of go into more of the meat of it, thinking about, I call you up, you don't answer the phone, I get your voicemail, I hang up. Then 2 or 3 days later, I'm like, dude, you never called me back. What protocol has been established that anybody would say that that's a requirement, when I think culturally we've come to the conclusion that that's an expectation with some people. They just assume that that's what would happen. But I'm of the mindset that if I've got something to tell you that has to be on the phone, I'm at least going to say, hey, at your convenience, if you could call me back, I've got a couple things I want to run past you, not or leave the voicemail and just say, hey, you don't need to call me back. this is what I wanted to ask you. When you have time, if you want to shoot me an email or whatever, get me the answer, great. By and large, someone usually just calls me back. And then they haven't even listened to my voicemail, but whatever. So what I wanted to talk about today, that as we were kind of talking about communication, it made me start thinking about like events and incident responses. And like when you have a protocol in place, what are the communication methods that should be used? What are the expectations from either a business or a client to ensure that the right people are informed and what that looks like? And I know you're going to school right now, and some of the stuff you're taking kind of falls into this category of being able to assess and respond to different situations. What are your thoughts? Like, do you think that there's a specific, like, you should do A and then B and then C, or is it maybe less specific than that?
So it's actually funny that you mentioned about that. I've been recently studying about incident response plans, and I've kind of noticed a little trend of both, how some of them have like a chain of command where, a lot of when these incidents happen, they're either reported to like a specific team. And usually from there, though, I kind of noticed, you kind of evaluate, those type of the type of incident, and then kind of what asset it's going to, affect and how valuable, like especially with like patient health information.
Sure.
And like that's obviously super critical. So I could see like responses in that way after they, evaluate what's going on. If it's going to affect something like that, then the response will be a little bit faster and whatnot. But
so like what? Okay, so along those lines, when we think about communication, what's the fastest communication protocol we can use that comes to mind?
The fastest one I can think of is probably, like just a simple text or even a phone call, because those are just instant to your phone. And nowadays people have their phones on them nonstop.
And do you call one person, or is it like you send out like a more like a shotgun approach and try to get like the whole team?
I mean, it depends on, how big your organization is, I feel like. And because I think Blast, they have those automated text messages that happen a lot. And I think those are really useful in like these situations. I don't know if like maybe you could tell if there's any experience of that actually happening in the industry, but I know like those happen a lot of times with just a lot of other groups, such as like me being on sports teams in the past. Right. They'd send out the schedule for the next week, or even for work, in general.
I wonder if this gets into maybe the type of incident, right? So we use a product called Bark in the school district, and Bark is a tool that we use to monitor kids' emails, what they write in Google Drive. Basically anything that they've attached their school email to is getting monitored by Bark. Live people watch the content, and then we get notifications of like, here's an alert. Student it's in the category of, say, self-harm or obscene language. And so, we go in and look, well, as soon as it's self-harm and or harm to others, then they start looking more closely, and it's like, okay, I need to get someone looking at this right now. And if they don't see someone looking at it within, I think it's like a 45-minute window, then the phones start ringing. And so they have a protocol, like a tree of like, they call the first person in the list, and then so on and so forth. And if we don't answer, they call law enforcement. So like, that's the protocol for a situation like that. So I wonder if we're doing a good job in our space, in the cybersecurity space, when we talk about the incident response plan, because a lot of the response plans that I've looked at literally just say, we will notify managed service provider in the event of a breach. Awesome. Like, how quickly? What are you going to say to them? Like, there's so many things that seem to be just completely left out of an incident response plan. And yet we have some of the best communication tools at our disposal that I've ever seen in 20 years. In fact, you can't even just look at email anymore and not be exposed to, I can get a chat right inside my email sidebar that says, dude, check this out.
Yeah. And I completely agree. And I think that like routine checks on all of these type of things are really important.
Like a
Just to make,
tabletop exercise?
yeah, and making sure that your processes are up to date, and I think that's really important. And I think it's also awesome that you mentioned how fast your response should be, because that was one thing that my personal teacher in one of my courses emphasized greatly when we were trying to write our example response proposals. And they were like, make sure you kind of talk about some of the examples of how fast you should respond to certain scenarios like that. And I think tools and technology to detect these things are really important also, but I think human reports are just as important, to make those digital so that they're able to be communicated with other people. Because you might get an instance in your case of a teacher reporting misuse of technology of one of their students. And I think it's just as important for that report to be able to get digitalized and be able to communicate with other people to notify them what's going on and whatnot too.
Well, I think you brought up a really good point. And this is an area where I think as an industry, we're all struggling with, and that is the AI versus people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So AI is kind of infinite, right? So like when I put an AI tool in place, it doesn't sleep, it doesn't eat, it doesn't have to go take kids to school from school. It's basically, I don't want to say set it and forget it, but it's doing something specific that is helping reduce the strain on resources. But one of the fundamental problems, I think, in our space is that we hope, or we're constantly in this hope, pray, love model. I think that's a book, to have the tool sort of replace the person, right, over time. And the reality is, as we continue to add more and more tools to the stack, we suddenly realize we need more and more people to interpret what the stacks are telling us. Like, do I really need to have law enforcement intervene because a child has, copied and pasted the lyrics to a song into Google Drive, and that song happens to contain, some explicit, vulgar, it's an Eminem album or whatever it might be, that just doesn't have an okay path to it.
Yeah, I definitely think though, for now and for the time being, that once these are automated, and they've been detected through automation, and a lot since that's been used a lot, I still think it's good to have those still reviewed by individuals and whatnot. I know, just talking about healthcare and stuff like that, they have a lot of new technologies to detect things on x-rays that a doctor might not see, and MRIs and CAT scans. And
Right.
they still have doctors to review those things when they occur, because you don't want some automation technology to mess up a diagnosis like that. So I kind of relate it to kind of your scenario in the school districts, of how I still think a team that has responsibilities and roles should be looking at these type of reports and incidents and stuff like that.
Right. It's so now that's kind of like a good segue. We talked about, like, sort of, are you checking on the protocols in place? Are they working? Right. You're only as good as what you've got set up, like the end user that changes their phone number, right? Like, and they're the number one person on the team. Did the incident response plan get updated to include the new phone number, or is it still calling the old one, busy signal, and you don't even have a protocol in place to call somebody else?
Yeah, I definitely think it's important, like you were talking about, to make sure those routine checks are done and updated, and even just reviewing policies and procedures. I think that's one thing that sometimes might get overlooked, and those policies and procedures can become stale if they're not reviewed routinely and stuff. In order to, a lot of those policies and procedures are used and implemented to help for compliance too. And with this age of new regulations coming nonstop, I think it's like more emphasis on how important it is to routinely check up on those things.
So let's shift gears a little bit. It makes me think about, the other pieces that kind of go along with this. When we text message or use short text, messaging,
Yeah.
it doesn't come with like a subject line, right? But I think that like by default, like if I'm typing it personally, it doesn't have a subject line to it. But I think that's one of the other areas that we struggle with. Like, I don't know how many times I've had someone send me an email and it's no subject line. Like it says subject in parentheses and it says no, or says no subject next to it. I just want to delete those, right? Like I don't even want to look at them. In fact, most of the time I do delete them because if you are not patient enough to put a subject line in, should I be patient enough to read this? And I'm not saying that to say that I've never read an email with no subject, especially when I'm on the phone with somebody like, here, let me send it to you. I get the urgency that comes up and we might make mistakes. But what I think about though, when we look at like a notification or alert response systems is if the subject line says, server down, I'm pretty clear that there's a problem with a server, even if the detailed subject line doesn't specifically say which one, and I now have to read the email. It wasn't a critical issue necessarily, right? So I'm seeing it via email as opposed to, a text message or my phone ringing that, hey, your server's down. But I think that's kind of the triage model, right? So if I don't respond to the email and there's a period of time that's gone by, and now my phone is chirping with a text message, and if I wait any longer, my phone rings. To me, that sounds like a bad process because it means that everything that's been tried with me so far is failing. Why are we continuing to attempt with the same person rather than more of, I don't know, a shotgun approach or get somebody quicker?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, that's the only thing I can think about is what you're talking about to help combat that is like a shotgun approach of, if one person isn't answering that is usually designated for that role and responsibility, it should, go into, their next chain of command or their coworker or counterpart. I don't know if you think that could be a solution, or do you think like a chain of command should be used there or just like a general net other, incident response team, member? Or do you think it should be more of like a chain of command?
I think that the response plan is all about getting boots on the ground when it's a serious incident, right? So just because you escalate it doesn't necessarily get somebody faster if you're going from many to one, right? Like the sooner, if we start escalating and there's less people in the chain that move up, then you also reducing the probability of someone answering, right? Because you're shotgun approach of say 5, the probability of one person answering is much higher than going to the person at the top where there's only one person and getting a response from them, especially when you find out, and they're on vacation out of cell service or whatever for the next 10 days. Well, it's a good thing I called them 4 times because they're never going to answer.
Yeah. So I guess that makes sense with what you're saying.
I think it's kind of like, knowing what communication tools to use based on the urgency of the protocol, right? So if this is an emergency hard down, you might call, say, the knock phone number, and whoever answers the phone is now the triage point person for this. But I can think of other scenarios where it's like you got your forensics team doing threat intelligence, and they're not sure at this point if it's a false positive or a real event. They may start with an email that says, hey, we're looking into this. You don't need to respond yet. And I think culturally, we've kind of screwed that up, right? You said this before we got on the call. What's acceptable for me to respond to a text message that you've just sent me now, in an hour, in 3 days? I mean, if we look at email that has no question in the email outside of an FYI, why am I replying to that email? So if you send me a text message that says, hey, we're coming through Mount Pleasant or St. Louis tomorrow on Tuesday, we'll be there at 3:00. Do you need to respond? Like, unless you need to give them more information back, you're like, sweet, they told me they'll be here at 3:00.
Yeah, I think it comes down to, the awareness and the trust you have on those people that you're sending things to, because I know some people that I'll send a text or an email to, and I know they have good enough awareness that they're going to see that, and I'll feel comfortable with them not replying. But
right, because you can see that they saw it too.
Yeah, and we do have technologies that do that too, and I don't think those are used as often. I mean, we don't really have one of those for like email and stuff like that, but I think still in some of those instances, I might email somebody just for them to be aware of that, and I'm putting my trust in them that they're going to, have their due diligence to check their email and, read that email that, I sent to them, because I'm not going to send them something that is not important.
Right.
And I think that's also another part of the thing of, why somebody might not, look at it, and that might lead people to thinking that, they need to reply really fast. It's sometimes we send things that don't need to be sent, and sometimes we just send things just because.
We send stuff we don't need to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that is a occurrence that does happen a lot, and I don't really know how to combat that. I'm gonna be completely honest. I don't know if you have any idea of how to really combat oversharing, because I feel like that does happen a lot.
I think oversharing is a symptom of a larger problem. So I think oversharing is directly tied to data leakage. I think it's tied to not understanding the responsibilities of the information that's being shared, of protecting the information. So I think about, I have patient health information in my hands. I got an actual medical record, and you reach out to me via text message, and you like, and let's just say I was a doctor, like, hey doctor, I need so-and-so's medical record. I'm like, sure, no problem. And I just email it to you. Well, I've broken all kinds of HIPAA, laws and rules. But on top of that, was that really what the person requesting needed? Do they need the whole medical record? Were they looking for, yesterday's visit, the responsive systems and what needs to be shared maybe with somebody else? There's so many pieces that come into play right there that you're like, had the person requesting information been specific about what they're asking for, then you getting that request can also be intentional in your response.
Yes, but I also think that it is, that worker, whether it be a nurse or the doctor themselves, I think it's really important for them to ask those questions and get down to the point of, and I think that just comes down to, them understanding the value of the information that they're dealing with, and.
But I think we can't be in the blame game, right? So I think this is whether I'm on the receiving end or I'm the requester, that we both have to be intentional about information, and when we're not, we end up oversharing.
Yes, I agree 100% with that.
And then what? So let's say we're not oversharing per se, or we want to rule out oversharing be an issue. If we use certain communication methods and we can ensure that data leakage is not happening, that it is secured at transit and at rest, then is oversharing a problem? So you've got two sides of sort of the same hurdle or same obstacle. One is to address oversharing, and the other piece is whatever is being shared is done in a way that's not back to oversharing again, right? So I think information by its very nature being communicated through any sort of digital medium by its very nature is oversharing, right? Because I have now taken a copy of something and I have sent it to you, and so now it is in at least two places instead of just one.
Yes, yeah, the data just multiplies, and I think a lot of people don't recognize that and are aware of that, and that's why I think everything just comes down to, a lot of the times it's just awareness and educating and
where is my data, right? Where is the information? Where is it at now? You're asking me for it, so I know that if I get it from wherever it is and give it to you, it has now been moved again. Do we know how many times it's been moved and left a footprint behind it that either needs to be cleaned up and removed, or it needs to be addressed from the standpoint I'm retrieving it and pulling it back?
Yeah, and you just brought up another great point about, documentation and details, and I think that's a really important part of this communication.
And no one wants to do that part. The documentation is by and large the most important piece of any communication process, incident response plan, etc. Because if you tell me it's in your head and you know what to do because you've memorized my phone number, oh yeah, I changed my phone number. Great process.
So then in this situation, then how do you fix that then to get your employees, in the SMBs that you work with, or they might ask you for help, how do you get them to do more documentation then?
Well, you just put what's the sort of the crux of all of this, that we should have just said. This entire episode is about documentation so that you can effectively communicate, because you have a process and protocol to follow. I think documentation is difficult because, and like the class that you're taking with regards to learning how to write for IT, is none of the rest of us that are out there in the SMB and IT managed services space, we didn't take a how to write for IT class. We're happy and excited that we have vendors who have created tools that make it easier for me to write our protocols into some sort of documentation form that is repeatable and accessible by the rest of my team. What we haven't done is really establish some of the why pieces so that we understand what is the real outcome, because it's not just to have it documented, right? It's to have it be a repeatable process that anybody that looks at this document can do. So what happens is we get stuck on the repeatable process side and we start writing and we're like, this isn't a repeatable process. So we stop writing. If we just continue to follow the process of writing and allowed other people to look at it and encouraged people to do a tabletop exercise, have the conversations around, does this document satisfy our outcome? If it doesn't, let's keep working at it till it does. So I think the documentation world is, you could start out with a 10-page paper and no one's going to read 10 pages. So you have to figure out, okay, I've written the longhand version. Now I got to create this in a 1-page document so that when it's, the hair on fire situation, the server is smoking, that I'm not trying to find page 6 or 7 to figure out what I should do. I'm literally looking at the only page that has the steps that I need to go through right now and get this addressed.
Yeah. And like you were saying, I think that just effective writing is really critical into getting your point across and to bringing that awareness and making it effective. And effective writing isn't, like you were talking about just now about, having a 10-page paper, displaying what to do with everything. It's just making sure that I don't know, just the main points, and being able to understand the processes and being able to carry them out with, the given information. And I think, I don't know, it's kind of about, the functionality and security. You still want to have enough information for people to be able to understand and carry out these processes, but you also don't want to have, a 20-page paper explaining how to, boot up a computer,
Right. But so, I think that's where it starts. And I think that's where some of the challenges are, is don't be afraid to write a book the first time you try to do documentation. Just remember that no one wants to read the whole book. So when you're done writing the book and your 14 or 15, 20 plus chapters that are in this book, go, okay, what's pertinent in chapter 7 that I can create a 1-page document, call out what it is. And that's what I'm sharing. Not, here's the book, good luck finding it in the table of contents, and then go, oh, wrong chapter.
So do you think the process that, professionals should go by when going about this is to, almost on purpose excessively write too much and then kind of close it down? Or kind of, you think people should, lay everything out on the table and then kind of discuss it? Because I think also collaboration could be really helpful with understanding, how somebody might interpret what's being said here and there,
I don't think there's a right or a wrong way to do this. I really don't. I think it's the doing part that just needs to get done. So if I think about, if I'm writing the documentation for secure configuration on a Windows 2016 server, that's probably going to be a collaboration environment where we brainstorm what are the minimum security requirements we want to have happen on this server. And then getting into a lot of moving parts that make that up. And then going from that, what's the communication protocol that we need to have in place? And that becomes a 1-pager to say, in the event that this fails, or when you're configuring this and you've missed a step, this is what you need to go back through and do the checklist for. That may involve, it's separating operational IT from more of like the communication protocol because a security event has occurred. So on the operational side, my engineer might need to go through a 20-page document from start to finish to get a 2016 server dialed in. But what I care about in the ticket that was created is that I said that these 10 things are what you need to get done. And oh, by the way, here's a documented manual to ensure that you get it right every single time.
Yeah. And I think that having a process like that just is able to bring systems and other activities. I think that's is able to bring them back up to speed as fast as possible. I think that is
100%.
the best way to do it. I mean, that's just the best way to have quicker responses. And even if you have to minimize some of your processes, down to a more minimal state,
right,
before they're able to be brought up, I think that is another really important thing to bring up also, because that definitely happens a lot. I mean, that you have some instances where things shut down completely, but I
right.
think also it's good to have, more of like a sub tier for your processes before they're brought up back to normal and stuff.
Well, there you have it. We went from email to documentation and communication and everything in between. But the bottom line is, if you want to have good communication, you got to have good protocols in place that are documented to ensure that the right people at the right time are getting the message. This has been an episode of MSP 1337. Thanks, everybody, and have a great week.